Welcome back. As I mentioned in our first class, consciousness is the knowing or cognizant aspect of our awareness. It is that which knows we are experiencing something. So if we think of consciousness as a sort of container of experience, things like thoughts and emotions and our perceptions are often what are referred to as the contents of consciousness. When we are children, our sense of self begins to emerge, and we all have something called a healthy sense of self and an unhealthy sense of self. The healthy sense of self is very kind, it's compassionate, it's generous, it's very loving. And it's the part of us that also sees a pile of shoes and says, oh, those ones are mine. Now, the unhealthy sense of self is the other side of that. That is the hypercritical and judging aspect. Everything we experience, including thought, influences our sense of self, including the healthy sense of self and the unhealthy sense of self. And this happens whether or not we're conscious of it. In fact, most of the time, we are completely oblivious to this process. Our sense of self is how we orient ourselves in the world, and it's often called the ego. And if you've been running around in spiritual or self-help groups, you may have heard of destroying the ego. The ego's bad. No ego. We don't want it. But there's actually no need to destroy the healthy ego. It is the unhealthy ego that is the problem. As Taylor Swift sings, "Hi, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me." So this I or me would be the ego. And what Taylor is referring to is her unhealthy ego or unhealthy sense of self. This I or me is very opinionated about everything. It has likes and dislikes. Those, of course, are judgments. It knows how to analyze our environment and keep us safe from danger. However, our perceptions are very convoluted and clouded, and we tend not to see things as they really are. We believe that we are experiencing reality, but what we are actually experiencing is our understanding of reality. And again, this is incredibly convoluted. I will explain this in quite a bit greater detail in future teaching sessions that are live, but for the purposes of this being a pre-recorded class, I am going to just leave you with a quote from one of my favorite movies, The Matrix. And Morpheus says, "What's real? How do you define real?" If you're talking about what you can feel or you can smell or you can taste, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. Now, what Morpheus describes is what we can feel or experience in the present moment, not in the past or in the future. The thinking mind reinforces what we believe about ourselves and how we perceive the world around us. Beliefs, however, are nothing more than expressions of thought, and they are something that we rarely question, even though we should. Maybe you've heard the saying that thoughts create reality, and that's true, sort of. I can think and I can wish and I can believe with my whole being that $1 million will appear in front of me. But it hasn't happened because it doesn't really work like that, despite what many social media influencers or gurus might have you believe. What happens is thoughts influence our actions and habits, which inevitably shape our entire lives. For instance, if we think a sad thought or access a sad memory, then we can experience sadness in the present moment. Anxiety is typically caused and perpetuated by an obsessive concern about the future, and that is actually not a real place. And a classic symptom of depression is rumination or obsessive analysis of the past, also not a real place. Humans, as you know, are amazing storytellers. And we have subconsciously convinced ourselves that obsessing over past mistakes will make things better. And then we beat ourselves up about it instead of offering ourselves grace and forgiveness. Some of us even subconsciously manufacture an imaginary future where things will be better, or we catastrophize about the future, which looks very dark and bleak. And this creates a lot of emotional turmoil. So thoughts might arise in the present, but they are not real. They're not tangible. We can't touch them or hold them or feel them. They are just mental phenomena. We are typically completely enmeshed with our thinking mind and identified with our thoughts. We believe that our thoughts are us and that we are our thoughts. And again, this is because we identify the thinking mind as me, or it's coming from me. So having a belief about a thought is actually thinking about thoughts. What? Now, we like to believe that we are in control of the thinking mind, but we aren't. And this is actually kind of liberating in a way. We actually cannot control what thoughts appear when, or how long they will last, or even how they express themselves. They just appear, express themselves, and disappear. Have you ever had a thought that was disturbing to you? Of course you have. We all have. You might have even criticized yourself for having such thoughts. You might judgmentally question, what is wrong with me? So judging a thought is another example of thinking about a thought. So if you can't control your thoughts, what's the point then? Well, by learning this practice of mindfulness, you begin to change your relationship to the thinking mind. And the result of this is that thoughts are no longer in control of you. So then how do you do this? Well, first, we need to recognize what a thought even is, which is what you did in the previous exercise. So how do you experience thoughts? Do you experience an internal monologue, like stories you're telling yourself? Or do they play out in front of you like some sort of mental movie that you're the star of? Next, we recognize that our thoughts are not us, so we disidentify with them by taking the perspective of observer of thought rather than the perspective of the thinker. So if we're here, the thought is happening to us, we are thinking a thought. When we become the observer, awareness is over here and thought is here. So thoughts, observer. Think about it as being a witness or the audience of. When we think that our thoughts are happening to us and we're somehow in control of them, then we often feel victimized by this process or victimizing ourselves, and we take part in this self-loathing and judgment. But when we take the perspective of the observer of thought, whether it be like watching a movie play in front of you or like listening to a podcast, if your thoughts are more like an internal monologue, then the thoughts are no longer happening to you, but instead playing out in front of you. You become the audience and the witness to these thoughts, and they become the object of your meditation practice in the same way that the breath or sounds or observation of the body can be your object. Then after you recognize the way that a thought appears to you, you can just recognize it as a thought. For some people, labels are helpful. You can label it thinking or thought, and then simply return to the breath or sound if that is your anchor. I tend personally to prefer the label thinking because in my mind, this tells me or helps me understand or observe it as a process rather than a thing to grab onto. So please experiment with this and see what's best for you. When we recognize the thinking mind or observe a thought expressing itself, it quickly and oftentimes instantaneously disappears in this self-liberating fashion. So when we practice mindfulness of thought, we notice, oh, there's a thought. And in that moment that we have recognized that we are thinking, the thought has expressed itself and then it disappears, almost like a bubble that bursts the moment you look at it. So a thought is arising and you say, oh, thought, and it disappears. It's wild. Another way of thinking about this is if you've ever had a really juicy thought that you wanted to share, and then the moment you go to open your mouth, it's gone. Mindfulness of thought is kind of like this. When we are not a participant in our thoughts, when we are not on the train that has been hijacked, and we are just observing them, they only last a fraction of a second. Now, when we take the perspective of observer rather than the thinker, we can actually watch this entire thing play out. We can watch the beginning or the arising of the thought, the middle, how the thought expresses itself, and then the end as it drifts off away. Just as we watch the beginning or arising of the inhalation of the breath, the middle, which is kind of the pause between the inhalation and exhalation, and then the exhalation or the end of the breath as it falls away. And as we do this, we begin to notice thoughts as a process rather than a thing. And when we notice thoughts as a process, we can actually pay attention to the patterns of thought. We can notice what thought triggered which thought, and then we can also recognize that they are just mental phenomena that influences our perceptions. So since you have already learned mindfulness of body and emotions and how to practice RAIN, you can use this foundation to recognize a thought as it might trigger or perpetuate an emotional process. So when we become aware of this patterning or our mental conditioning, we start to unravel this habitual and destructive thinking and behavior and the way that it connects to our emotional body. Eventually, this leads to just a happier and more peaceful existence. So in the next video, we will be practicing mindfulness of thought in a similar way that we have been practicing mindfulness all together. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next practice video.